Chapter 2: The Shores of Silence. But this story isn't just about Chinese Canadians. Asian heritage in Canada is a tapestry. Many threads, many communities, each with their own chapter of arrival, of struggle, of survival. Let me take you to another shore, another ship, another moment that changed everything. May 23rd, 1914. Vancouver Harbor. A ship called the Komagotamalu arrives. On board, 376 passengers, mostly Sikh men from the Punjab region of India, then under British colonial rule. They were British subjects. They carried British passports. They had every legal right, they believed, to enter another British territory. Canada disagreed. The ship was forced to anchor in the harbor. For 2 months to full months, those 376 men sat on that ship in the summer heat, denied entry, denied supplies, running low on food and water. Canadian authorities would not let them disembark. Immigration officials came aboard to enforce exclusion laws that had been specifically designed, in language as coded as it was deliberate, to prevent South Asian immigration. The community on shore rallied. The passengers protested. Lawyers were hired. Legal challenges were mounted. And still, the ship sat. On July 23rd, 1914, 2 months after arriving, the Komagotamalu was escorted out of Vancouver Harbor by a Canadian Navy vessel. The passengers were forced to return to India. When the ship arrived in Calcutta, British colonial authorities were waiting. They believed the passengers had been radicalized by their humiliation. Violence broke out. 19 passengers were killed. 19 people who had simply wanted to come to Canada died because Canada said no. It would take 101 years for Canada to formally apologize for the Komagotamalu incident. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued that apology in the House of Commons in 2016. 101 years. Now let's talk about a community that did establish roots in Canada before the walls went up. A community that farmed, fished, built businesses, raised children, became Canadian in every meaningful sense of the word, and then had everything taken from them in a matter of weeks. Japanese Canadians. By the early 20th century, Japanese Canadians had built thriving communities in British Columbia. They fished the coast. They farmed the valleys of the Fraser River. Their children were born on Canadian soil, spoke English, went to Canadian schools. And then came December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor, and the fear, the paranoia, the racism, the opportunity that swept through Canada in its wake. On February 24th, 1942, the Canadian government invoked the War Measures Act. Every person of Japanese ancestry living within 100 miles of the BC coast, regardless of whether they were Canadian-born, regardless of whether they had never set foot in Japan, was declared a threat to national security. 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly relocated from their homes. They were given days, sometimes hours, to pack what they could carry. Their homes were seized. Their fishing boats were confiscated and sold. Their farms were taken over. Their businesses were shuttered. Their bank accounts were frozen, and they were sent to internment camps in the BC interior, places like Greenwood, Coslow, Sandon, remote, isolated, cold in winter, brutally hot in summer, barracks with thin walls and inadequate heat. Men were separated from their families and sent to road camps or sugar beet farms as forced labor. And here is the detail that cuts deepest to me. When the war ended in 1945, Japanese Canadians were not simply freed. The government gave them a choice. They could voluntarily relocate east of the Rockies, permanently, or they could be deported to Japan. A country many of them had never been to. A country that had just lost a devastating war. Approximately 1,000 Japanese Canadians were deported. Many were Canadian citizens. Many were children. The last of the internment orders weren't lifted until 1949, 4 years after the war ended, and the property that had been seized, it was never fully returned. The government had sold much of it, often at a fraction of its value, during the war. It took until 1988 for the Canadian government to formally apologize. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney stood in the House of Commons and said what should have been said decades earlier. Surviving internees received $12,000 in compensation. Japanese Canadian community organizations received $12 million. Was it enough? The survivors I've read about, their accounts, their memoirs, they don't answer that question the same way. Some say the apology mattered more than the money. Some say nothing could be enough. Some say they had spent so many years being told to move on, to not talk about it, that they'd buried the grief so deep it had become part of them. But they accepted the apology because acceptance, grace, even in the face of injustice, seems to be woven into this community's DNA. Chapter 3. The Invisible Contributions. I want to pause here for a moment, because I've been telling you about suffering, and the suffering is real and it matters, and we need to look at it directly. But there's another side to this history, a side that's just as important and arguably even more invisible in the mainstream telling of the Canadian story. The contributions. Let's start here. Did you know that Chinese Canadians served in World War II? Think about that for a second. The Chinese Immigration Act, the law that banned Chinese immigration and stripped Chinese Canadians of most civil rights, including the right to vote, was still in effect when World War II broke out. Chinese Canadians couldn't vote. They were barred from most professions. They couldn't own property in many areas. They were, in the eyes of Canadian law, second-class residents, not even citizens in any meaningful sense. And yet, over 500 Chinese Canadians enlisted to fight for Canada in World War II. Let me say that again. They volunteered to die for a country that had told them, in law, that they didn't fully belong to it. Why? The reasons were complex. Some enlisted because they believed in the Allied cause. Some because they thought military service might be the key to acceptance, that proving their loyalty on the battlefield might finally open doors that law had kept closed. Some because their neighbors, their friends, their communities were enlisting, and they were Canadian in every way that mattered to them, regardless of what the government said. Whatever the reasons, they served. They fought in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific. And here's something most people don't know. The Canadian military specifically recruited Chinese Canadians for clandestine operations in Southeast Asia through something called Force 136. Because they could pass as locals in Japanese-occupied territories, they were sent behind enemy lines as spies and saboteurs. They risked their lives not just as soldiers but as operatives. And when they came home, if they came home, Canada finally extended the right to vote to Chinese Canadians in 1947. Let's talk about South Asian Canadians. The Sikh community in British Columbia, descendants of those who managed to enter Canada before the walls went up, built some of the first gurdwaras in North America. They established farms in the Fraser Valley that would become cornerstones of BC's agricultural industry. They sent their sons to fight in both world wars, and quietly, persistently, generation after generation, they fought for recognition, for civil rights, for the right to vote not granted until 1947. For the right to bring their families over, for the right to enter professions that had been legally closed to them. One story I want to share, and I think it captures something essential about this period. There was a woman named Carter Kaur China, a Punjabi woman who came to Canada in the 1920s, one of the very few South Asian women to make it through immigration at that time. She raised her family in the Fraser Valley. She helped run the family farm. She raised children who would go on to become doctors, teachers, community leaders. She never got to vote in a Canadian election until she was in her 40s. She had spent her entire adult life in Canada, contributing to this country, raising Canadians, and the country had spent that whole time telling her she wasn't quite Canadian enough. When the right to vote was finally extended, she voted in every single election for the rest of her life. Without exception, her daughter said she treated it like a sacred act. Because for her, it was. And then, there's the wave of Southeast Asian refugees, the Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian communities who arrived in Canada in the late 1970s and early 1980s, fleeing war and genocide. The Boat People, as they were called in the news coverage of the time. Canada's response to this crisis is actually one of the more quietly remarkable chapters in the country's immigration history. After decades of exclusionary policies, Canada threw open its doors. Between 1979 and 1980 alone, Canada resettled over 60,000 Indo-Chinese refugees, one of the highest per capita refugee intakes of any country in the world at that time. Many of them arrived with nothing but their lives, and they built restaurants, businesses, community organizations, places of worship. They put their children in Canadian schools, and those children grew up to become doctors, engineers, politicians, artists, athletes. They became Canadian in that deep, authentic way that can only come from choosing a place, from working, suffering, and hoping for it. The Filipino community, largely invisible in mainstream Canadian history, built an extraordinary presence in this country through the live-in caregiver program and other immigration streams. Filipinos came to Canada as nurses, caregivers, domestic workers. They took care of Canada's elderly, Canada's sick, Canada's children, often at the cost of being separated from their own families for years while waiting for permanent residency. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the disproportionate impact on Filipino healthcare workers became impossible to ignore. These were people who had been quietly essential for decades, finally seen in sharp relief. The Korean community, the South Asian tech workers who came through the 1990s immigration boom, the Chinese students who came for university and stayed to build companies, the Japanese artists and architects who left their fingerprints on Canadian cities. Every thread, every community, every story